On the 29th of July 2024, there was an attack in Southport of unparalleled cruelty. Nothing matching the extreme and very particular depravity of this event has previously occurred in the United Kingdom, certainly in modern times. A teenager, to whom I shall refer as AR, then aged 17, perpetrated a chilling and carefully planned assault armed with a large knife that he had recently bought online via Amazon. He travelled by taxi to a Taylor Swift-themed dance and yoga event where he killed and inflicted devastating injuries on as many children as he was able. He did not hesitate in the process to assault and gravely injure two adults who were in his path. AR had earlier selected this particular venue as his target, and I am confident, based on the advertising for this event on social media, that he was fully aware that those attending would be very young girls, along with the two female organisers. It is fundamental in considering why AR acted in this inhuman way to understand that he was not suffering from any kind of mental illness. What occurred in this case, therefore, cannot be explained on the basis that his violence was a regrettable symptom or consequence of a serious mental disorder such as psychosis. A variety of professionals considered AR's mental state prior to and following his despicable actions on the 29th of July, and no relevant psychiatric diagnosis has ever been advanced. What we know instead is that from his early teens, he had become ever more fixated on extreme violence. I have no doubt at all that this disturbing preoccupation had been fed during the many years when, wholly unsupervised and lacking any parental controls, he spent the majority of his waking hours online. The strong indications are that he fueled his perversely violent fixation by viewing a wide range of deeply inappropriate and disturbing subjects that are all too available on the internet. It is no coincidence that one of the last things he did before he left his family's home to commit these cruel offences was to locate a graphic and simply appalling video on X, formerly known as Twitter, of a knife attack on Bishop Emmanuel in Australia. This was, beyond doubt, in my view, to strengthen his resolve to carry through with his cowardly and murderous plan. Furthermore, this attack was perpetrated by a young person who it was known was potentially highly dangerous. He had carried a knife, including most particularly to school, on multiple previous occasions, and he had unemotionally and repeatedly admitted, long before the events of the 29th of July, that he had done so intending to kill or to cause others really serious harm. His parents and multiple officials from a wide range of relevant organisations knew this, albeit at differing levels of detail. Rigorously putting out of mind the so-called benefits of hindsight, I have no doubt that if appropriate procedures had been in place and if sensible steps had been taken by the agencies and AR's parents, this dreadful event would not have happened. It could have been, and it should have been, prevented. Over a long period of time, AR had become an aggressive, near-total recluse who bullied and threatened his family and unashamedly lied to officials. As a teenager, he had researched websites selling a wide range of knives, crossbows, bows and arrows, machetes, sledgehammers, and the items needed for making multiple Molotov cocktails. He had asked his father to buy him petrol, and he had purchased a sizable petrol can. A number of weapons or other potentially lethal items of this kind had been purchased by him online and delivered to the family's home address. Indeed, he had bought, again online, the ingredients necessary for manufacturing the highly lethal poison ricin, and he had experimented with making a crude preparation of this exceptionally dangerous substance. To add to this truly worrying background, it should be remembered that for over 2 years before the attack on the 29th of July, AR had only ever left home by himself when he was intending to kill or seriously harm others. I cannot stress too strongly, therefore, that what happened on that terrible day was not, to use the familiar phrase, a bolt of lightning out of a clear blue sky. Instead, some form of grave violence by AR had been clearly, repeatedly, and unambiguously signposted over many years. Indeed, several professionals who had direct contact with him expressed serious fears, sometimes in stark terms, that he would go on to harm or kill. Those fears were communicated, and yet they did not result in the coordinated and effective action that was needed. One of the most striking conclusions from this inquirer's extensive investigation is the sheer number of the missed opportunities over many years to intervene meaningfully, which directly contributed to the failure to avert this disaster. Numerous systems that should have provided oversight, assessment, and protection were ineffective or inadequately used. Some failed outright. The consequences, as it does not need for me to say, were catastrophic. It is unrealistic to suppose that all violent individuals can be prevented from carrying out attacks on others. But when a truly grave risk has been clearly identified, our society is entitled to expect, at the very least, that meaningful and substantive steps will be taken to avert the impending disaster. That, conspicuously, did not happen in this case. I have made a significant number of criticisms in this report of various agencies, along with some of the individuals working within them, which in turn have resulted in a substantial list of recommendations as to future action in the hope of averting attacks of this kind in the future. These criticisms have not been made lightly. The organisations and individuals concerned have had an opportunity of considering and responding to them before the final conclusions were reached. I urge the media and online commentators not to latch onto individual sentences or isolated conclusions from the report, particularly if they're lifted out of their true context, in order to vilify or unfairly attack any of the individuals or the bodies for whom they work. With very few exceptions, I watched a large number of public servants give evidence who had diligently applied themselves to their work, often fulfilling high-pressured but under-resourced roles, and who acted at the time in what they considered to be in the best interests of our society. I urge the same approach in relation to AR's parents, about whom I have expressed a number of profound concerns. Notwithstanding their failures, AR placed his mother and father in an extremely difficult position, creating a domestic environment that was highly challenging. Their life at home must have become little short of a nightmare, given, to use the words of his own father, AR had turned into a monster. I have tried to ensure that the criticisms I have made are balanced, and I trust that the media and social media coverage of this report will be fair and that it will reasonably reflect the conclusions that I have reached. This is, of necessity, a long report. There is an early summary of the most notable overarching failures in the chapter entitled Fundamental Problems. For the purposes of this short introduction, I simply indicate that there were 5 principal failures that are central to understanding what occurred. First, no organisation or any of the multi-agency arrangements sufficiently accepted or enabled ownership of or overall responsibility for the risk posed by AR. Indeed, the laudable objective of involving multiple agencies operated, with only limited exceptions, to deter any one of them from undertaking a meaningful risk assessment, followed by the effective coordination of a proper response. There was a widespread but false assumption that this duty rested with some other organisation, when in fact no one was discharging this role. AR consequently fell through the cracks, as one witness presciently expressed her fears prior to the attack. This was a fundamental mistake which contributed to the dire consequences in this case. Such a failure must not be allowed to happen again. Agencies must not simply pass on the risk to others or assume others have taken on responsibility, with the result that there is, in fact, a total absence of a sustainable plan led by an identified organisation which, in turn, has nominated a particular individual with responsibility for coordinating the response to the identified threat. Second, there were notable and wholly avoidable examples of poor information management and information sharing within and between the relevant agencies. One alarming feature of this was that critical information was often diluted over time, with the result that the true risk posed by AR was insufficiently understood. This breakdown in the proper handling of information had significant consequences as regards the failure by the agencies to take appropriate steps to intervene to prevent the attack on the 29th of July. Third, AR's deeply problematic behaviour was too frequently excused on the basis of his perceived or later diagnosed autism spectrum disorder. Autism is not a mental illness. It is instead a neurodevelopmental condition, and I want to stress that it would be entirely wrong to make a general association between autism and an increased risk of the individual concerned becoming violent. Nevertheless, AR fell into a cohort of those with autism whose individual characteristics mean that this condition carries an increased risk of harm to others. Agencies regularly simply used autism as an explanation or even an excuse for his conduct, including his violence. Strategies and interventions were needed in order to address the risk he posed and the causes of it, but instead, as a result of this significant lack of understanding, the problem was left both unmanaged and underestimated. Fourth, there was a wholesale failure to oversee and intervene in AR's deeply inappropriate online activities. The lack of exploration of or engagement with AR's online life was a significant failing that hampered agencies in identifying and addressing the risk AR posed. How someone is behaving online is, in my view, an effective potential predictor as to how they will behave offline. Yet this route to understanding what was going on was entirely ignored. Notwithstanding AR's attempts to view violent imagery online at school, no curiosity was shown as regards the material he was researching at home during the months and years in which his behaviour increasingly deteriorated. Overall, only glancing interest was ever shown in AR's internet life, and when limited questions were asked, AR's false and self-serving replies were far too readily accepted. Fifth, and finally, although I have already referred to the difficulties they undoubtedly faced, AR's parents bear considerable blame for what occurred. All too frequently, they created significant obstacles to constructive engagement by AR with the various relevant agencies. They were too ready to excuse and defend the multiple examples of his wholly inappropriate actions and the lies which he told. They failed to stand up to his behaviour and to set boundaries. They neglected to investigate and prohibit AR's purchase of weapons which were arriving at the family home through the post. And they failed to report the dramatic escalation in the evident risk he posed in the period between the 22nd and the 29th of July, including perhaps most notably on the day of the attack itself. Against that background, I want to provide, in the shortest terms, my conclusions in relation to the central themes that have arisen during the course of the inquiry's hearings. I have already touched on some of the issues relating to the attack, the accumulation of weapons and the poison, the online harm that was caused to AR, and the role of his family. But it is equally important to focus on the part played by the police, including counter-terrorism police, the PREVENT programme, social care and healthcare, and AR's education. Whilst I stress the importance of the full description that is given in the relevant chapters of the report, my overall conclusions for each of these areas can be fairly summarized in what now very briefly follows. I have analysed the response by the police to 7 principal incidents involving AR. I am particularly concerned that a decision was reached not to arrest him in October 2019, despite the fact that he had taken a knife into school on at least 10 occasions, intending potentially to use it to kill or inflict really serious harm on another pupil. Although the officers acted with the best intentions, the possible need for a criminal investigation, whether by arrest or otherwise, was insufficiently considered on that occasion. There was a failure to strike the right balance between handling the clear risk AR posed to others and the need to avoid criminalising children. Furthermore, AR was found carrying a knife on a bus in March 2022. He was not arrested, and the incident was, in essence, treated as a safeguarding issue. AR should instead have been arrested by the officers who attended at the scene. In fairness to them, I stress that they were young officers operating within a policing culture that regarded custody as a last resort for children and, importantly, through no fault on their part, they did not have the full picture regarding AR's risk. In addition to carrying a knife, however, AR, without prompting, smilingly referred to poisoning others in the future and to having tried to manufacture poison in the past. Given he had said he wanted to stab someone with the knife he was carrying, this revelation concerning poisons should, without more, have led to his arrest. His home would then have been searched, and the items which would inevitably have been found would have led to criminal charges and a potential custodial sentence. As a consequence, the attack on the 29th of July would most probably not have occurred, albeit it is important that I stress that there were other missed opportunities further down the line. As to Prevent, AR was referred to Prevent on 3 occasions by the Acorn School in December 2019 and February and April 2021. In relation to the first referral, the Prevent officers should have checked, most particularly with AR's school, as to whether his explanations for his behaviour were reliable. Input from clinicians should have been sought regarding AR's autism. There was a failure by the school to provide and counter-terrorism police officers to obtain AR's internet browsing history whilst at school. This would have revealed that AR had been researching school shootings and searching online for images of the infliction of deeply unpleasant injuries. If these steps had been taken, AR's first referral would have been adopted by Prevent. Notwithstanding these mistakes, I accept that the Prevent officers acted with diligence, and they were hampered by an unhelpful lack of clarity as to whether Prevent should take on someone in AR's circumstances, namely an individual demonstrating signs of being fixated on violence, but without an adherence to a particular ideology. This uncertainty was a significant factor in my judgment. Nonetheless, rejecting AR for further action under the Prevent programme in response to the first referral was simply the wrong decision. Although the circumstances giving rise to the second and third prevent referrals were in themselves less serious, they ought to have prompted a reassessment of the risk posed by AR. There were, in addition to these failures, 3 further missed opportunities for agencies to make additional prevent referrals. Notwithstanding these various conclusions on the relevant evidence, I've been unable to determine with any degree of certainty as to what the outcome would have been if AR had in fact been adopted by the Prevent programme. Turning to social care, Lancashire County Council's employees clearly acted in what they considered to be the public interest, fulfilling difficult roles in challenging circumstances. There was, nonetheless, a notable lack of appreciation by the local authority of the need to manage the risk which AR posed to others. Indeed, the enduring focus of those involved with AR was on the risks to him rather than the need to protect the public from him. One of the key lessons from this terrible attack is that the present child protection system is imperfectly designed to cope with children and young people when it is apprehended there is a real risk that they may inflict serious harm on others. A consequence of this critically blinkered approach was that on a number of occasions, AR's case was closed by social care when that should not have happened. And equally, there were times when his case was not escalated to a higher level when this step was necessary. In both situations, AR's dangerousness was given insufficient consideration. In a similar vein, even making all due allowance for the impacts of COVID-19, there was a poor standard of management of AR under the court-imposed referral order in 2020. In particular, insufficient steps were taken to identify and tackle the causes of his offending. Finally, as a cross-cutting issue with the local authority, there were significant examples of poor record keeping and inadequate information sharing. In relation to healthcare, there was a significant failure to identify a lead agency which had principal responsibility for AR. Additionally, there should have been a comprehensive, medically informed and structured risk assessment of him based on the material information held by all the relevant agencies. I accept that such assessments are significant undertakings which need to be justified, but I have no doubt, once again putting entirely out of mind the benefits of hindsight, that this step was quintessentially necessary in AR's case. Linked to this significant omission was the troubling dilution over time of the information which revealed the extent of AR's risk to others, information which was held by those involved in his healthcare. As a consequence of this, important material from 2019 and early 2020, which amply demonstrated the appreciable risk of significant violence by AR, was not later taken into account by clinicians working with him. This failure to appreciate the risk he posed could have been avoided, either if the information systems had been better designed, or if the checks by the clinicians of the detailed records had been more diligent. AR's autism diagnosis was also unduly delayed, although I stress this was not a precondition for performing a comprehensive risk assessment. Although I accept that treatments were appropriately offered to AR and that the community mental health services were diligent and persistent in trying to engage with him, nonetheless, with certain limited exceptions, the overall assessment and management of the risk posed by AR on the part of the healthcare agencies was inadequate. Turning finally to education, AR's mainstream secondary school, the Range High School, made an unassailably correct decision permanently to exclude him when he repeatedly carried a knife to school in October 2019, intending, as he admitted, to use it to kill or to cause serious harm. AR had not been the victim of systematic bullying, despite his claims to the contrary, claims which form part of his attempted justification for his actions. The Acorn School, the pupil referral unit to which he was sent, deserves significant praise for its assessment of the risks that AR posed to others. It responsibly, proactively, and persistently sought to ensure that these well-founded fears were shared with the other relevant agencies and that they were properly addressed. By way of contrast, there was a significant failure by other organisations to pay sufficient heed to these clearly articulated concerns by the Acorn School. I have noted two lapses by the Acorn School. Firstly, there was a failure to provide AR's school internet browser history to prevent, as had been intended, and second, the school could have made a further prevent referral. Overall, however, I have concluded that the Acorn School reacted to the grave problems presented by AR in a notably impressive manner. Although AR's final school, Pressfield School, missed opportunities to become informed about his risks to others, this was of no causative effect because, despite Pressfield School's best efforts, AR barely attended. However, the evidence reveals clear deficiencies in the way risk information was shared between schools at the time. I have been reassured that Pressfield School has since taken remedial action, which steps, no doubt, need to be replicated more widely. Lancashire County Council failed in its obligation over a substantial period of time to investigate AR's prolonged absences from school or to consider the best means of addressing his educational needs by way of alternative schooling. The totality of these overarching problems and my conclusions in relation to the individual agencies, outlined, as I have already indicated, in far greater detail in the 2 volumes of the report, lead me to 2 principal conclusions. First, the attack on the 29th of July would not have occurred if AR's parents had reported to the authorities the full extent of what they knew in late July, including on the day of the attack. Second, if the relevant agencies, individually and collectively, had properly managed and responded to the known danger that he posed to others from December 2019 onwards, it is highly likely that this event would not have occurred. There would, instead, have been a range of entirely different outcomes, which would have included AR being taken into care as being beyond his parents' control, which he was, or into custody, for instance, as a result of his production or attempted production of the poison ricin. History simply would have taken a different course. As I have already said, this terrible event could have been and should have been prevented. The inquiry's terms of reference required me to cover within this phase the statutory matters which a coroner would conventionally address if the coronial inquests into the deaths of Alice, Bibi, and Elsie were to be resumed. Within my report, I have provided a narrative form of conclusion as to each of their deaths, which is as follows, and I quote, "While the sole immediate cause of death was unlawful killing by the perpetrator, the attack that led to the death was preventable. There was a serious failure by a number of relevant agencies over the preceding years to share risk information about the perpetrator, assess the risk he posed, and act on that information in an effective multi-agency way so as to mitigate the risk. More effective, earlier intervention would probably have led to the perpetrator's fascination with violence being recognized earlier and more clearly. This in turn would have revealed earlier criminal acts committed or in preparation by the perpetrator, leading to significant criminal justice and counter-terrorism interventions. The perpetrator's violent behavior was difficult for his parents to manage in the family's home. However, they had knowledge that he had purchased some weapons, and they knew he had tried to leave the house to carry out some form of attack at his old school just 1 week prior to the fatal attack, when there was a real risk that he was armed with a weapon. They also knew of empty knife packaging once the perpetrator left the family home on the day of the fatal attack. They failed to report this to the police or any other agency. From the date when the inquiry was formally authorised by the previous Home Secretary to commence its work in April last year, we have completed the entire Phase 1 exercise within 12 months. It has been a substantial undertaking, only made possible because of 3 critical factors. First, I have been supported by an extraordinarily impressive team who have undertaken a vast amount of work. The 4 counsel to the inquiry, led by Nicholas Moss, King's Counsel, along with the individual teams working under the solicitor to the inquiry, Caroline Featherstone, and her deputy, Ross Howarth, and the secretary to the inquiry, Kate Anderson, have provided me with utterly invaluable assistance. Second, the core participants have shown the highest levels of professionalism and cooperation, frequently having to address complex issues and questions within a very tight time frame. I am grateful for the unwavering and uncomplaining support they have consistently provided. But thirdly, and preeminently, the families of the deceased, together with the other victims and their families, have offered me and my team a level of encouragement and understanding without which we would have been unable to complete our task on time or with the level of confidence that has been achieved. It goes without saying that I am greatly indebted to them and their legal advisors. This stage of the inquiry has consistently had the victims and their families at its core. Indeed, this entire exercise has principally been to ensure that the true history to this terrible event has been laid bare for their understanding, without anything being held back or ignored. we have attempted to shine a penetrating light on everything of relevance that happened in the months and years leading up to the 29th of July 2024. I strongly believe that this exercise, by revealing the detail of the numerous and significant mistakes and omissions, has demonstrated that steps can realistically be taken that will greatly reduce the risk of this appalling event ever being repeated in the future, certainly as regards violence-fixated individuals who are known to pose a real risk of inflicting serious harm. I cautiously express the hope that the victims have found this a worthwhile undertaking. We will now turn immediately to phase 2, in which we will address certain overarching issues along with others of particular difficulty, which will require more detailed consideration than could have been achieved in phase 1. I have been informed that the Home Secretary will release the phase 2 terms of reference today, and I hope to conclude phase 2 within a similar time frame to phase 1. Finally, and of the highest importance, we should conclude phase 1 of this inquiry by focusing our thoughts on the deceased, the other victims, and all their families. I ask that in just a moment we all stand for a minute's silence to pay tribute to the 3 young girls who were killed, Alice, Bibi, and Elsie, and to all those who were physically and psychologically injured, some very gravely, with truly significant enduring consequences, and to their families whose lives have been irreparably changed. Would you all please stand? Thank you all very much.